Okay. All right. Let's go to the next slide. First of all, I do want to make sure that we look at loss as real or perceived deprivation of something deemed meaningful. This includes death or non-death related. Please, you know, I'm a CPE educator as well. And one thing that I remind my students is loss is everywhere. Loss is everywhere. So I think I want you to just get into your minds this whole idea of loss and the possibility of how people may be dealing with and grappling with loss. And it may be a death, it may be loss of a limb, it might even be loss of their career because now because of their PTSD or because of their injury, they're no longer able to work like they had in the past. So keep that in mind, this whole idea of loss. Now, grief is the emotion that's generated by the experience of loss, characterized by sorrow or distress. And then we have this other thing, this anticipatory grief, grieving that occurs prior to the actual loss. So if I know that I might lose my job, if I know that, oh my gosh, the doctor just told me that they may not be able to save this leg, if I know that my loved one is dying, some people may start showing signs of anticipatory grief. All right, next slide. We can go to the next slide. Now, the mourning is a process that people go through leading to the adaptation of the loss. Now, get it? It's the process leading to, it's not the adaptation to the loss, it's the process. It refers to like socially prescribed practices or outward expressions of grief that can apply to both death-related. You're saying you can't hear me? I'm sorry, Mr. Diego.
We can hear, I can hear you, you're fine. Diego, you may need to call in. I'll attach the numbers again.
All right, sorry. So it's prescribed as an outward expression of grief that can apply to both death-related and non-death-related circumstances. You know, I remember when I was a brand new CPE student and I went to someone's room and they were really having a hard time with the loss of their pet, the pet that they had for 12 years, the pet that was a companion. So again, keep in mind that it could be almost anything. Now, bereavement is the period of sorrow following the death of a significant other. And this term is associated mostly with death of an individual. Okay, next slide. So I want to present next that when we have uncomplicated grief, normal grief, it is going to impact someone's feelings. It's going to impact them in their heart. It's going to impact them cognitively, and it's going to impact them in many other ways. So sometimes we may actually see the feelings or encounter someone with the feelings before we even understand that there is a loss. So we may sadness, anger, guilt or self-reproach, anxiety, loneliness, fatigue, even feeling helpless, even the shock or this yearning for the loved one. And then, you know, we even have to talk about emancipation because some people may even feel some relief. I've seen that oftentimes when someone has been caring for a loved one for a long time. And so it's a mixed emotion where they're sad that the loved one has passed on, but at the same time happy that like, wow, okay, now my suffering might be over. Numbness, or even this sense of relief, which is very similar to emancipation. You can go to the next one. There may be some physical sensations of uncomplicated grief. Hollowness of the stomach, tightness in the chest or throat, oversensitivity to noise, depersonalization, where they depersonalize even the loved one that they lost, or they almost have a dissociation from the loss of their limb or the loss of their job. They try to minimize it. Shortness of breath, weakness in the muscles, lack of energy, and even dry mouth. What I want to just bring up now is that I want you to start, as you start listening to our patients, our veterans speak to us, we might be getting some clues that there is some grief going on, especially when we see some physical, they're talking about and complaining about some physical sensations. And I know that's really for the physician, but when we hear that, and then we're also hearing about some feelings, it's like, wait a minute, we may start getting suspicious there's something going on. Okay, we can go to the next slide. Now, there's also in our head, so they've got this feeling, which I call the heart, and then we got some head, where there's a disbelief or some confusion, or it could also be some preoccupation or rumination with the loss of that loved one. I'm coming up on the anniversary of a major loss that I had of a cousin who was like a cousin-in-law, actually, was like a best friend. Well, I remember it was my birthday, and we went out that night before, and the next day she was dead. She died in her sleep. And I remember going through that whole rumination where I kept saying, yes, she died, and she went to sleep and she didn't wake up. And it was not until probably after I said it to the fifth person that I realized that I was there with this whole rumination of, wow, she went to sleep and she didn't wake up. People can always also talk about this whole sense of a presence, that they feel the person's presence, and also hallucinations. Okay, next slide. There could be some behaviors: disturbed sleep, appetite loss or appetite change, absent-mindedness, a social withdrawal, dreams about the deceased, crying, searching out or calling, or some restlessness. Next slide. Some more behaviors: avoiding places that remind them of the loved one. I mean, literally. I had a veteran that shared with me that he has maintained a storage facility for 3 years. And he put all of the items that came from the home that he and his wife shared after she died. And he has been paying for it for 3 years and avoided even dealing with it or going back to get anything out of that storage facility. So we could see that even in his case, he's got some grief going on that he's working through. We can do the opposite, where they visit places that remind, always going to their favorite restaurant, always going back to that place. You notice how people put memorials on the side of the highway, always going back to that place where someone died, always revisiting even mentally or emotionally that place where they lost a leg. So it could look so many ways. They can carry objects that remind them. They can treasure objects that remind them of the loved one. Next. Now, abnormal or complicated grief. And honestly, I think that in the VA, we probably see this a lot, especially for those of you who work in the mental health area. We may see a delayed grief. It's put off and reappears at a later time. It's often precipitated by a more current loss or stressor. So now we're also getting into this point of, yes, I see what you're saying there, of almost compounding the grief because they've had this loss. They've had the loss of their job. They've had the loss of their career. Yes, I can see that, Kristen, because with delayed grief, honestly, this is where we have to really pay attention to all of those signs because we see this more than anything else. Mass grief. This is another one that we see a lot, especially, again, those of you who work in the mental health areas. It's not obvious. It's not immediately following the loss, but appears later in the guise of physical symptoms or maladaptive behavior. Those of us who work with drug and alcohol, those of us who work with PTSD, we need to be very mindful that grief could be a part of the narrative. Next. So it could be an exaggerated grief, which refers to a magnification of usual grief symptoms. For example, a very depressed mood, anger or mild anxiety, of uncomplicated grief. It becomes like a clinical depression or a rage. again, mental health. Here we are. So next slide. So the mourning process, there are 3 types of processes that I'm going to run through the stages and phases because you're probably familiar with that, and I'm going to spend more time on the task. And these are just really ways of looking at and dealing with loss, grief, and mourning. Next slide. So some of you may have heard of Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, and Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, I think, is really excellent, especially with death and dying, because her initial work was really centered around death and dying. So she talks about the stage 1 as a denial, stage 2 as anger, stage 3 of bargaining, stage 4 is depression, stage 5 of acceptance. And it's more associated with death and dying. If you are working with death and dying, I definitely suggest that you read that. The phases is another school of thought about loss, grief, death, and that is by Parks, Bowlby, and Sanders. And you'll see that in the bibliography. Phase 1 is this whole idea of after the loss, feeling numb. Phase 2 is this yearning for the loved one, yearning for that limb, yearning for whatever the loss was, even yearning for my career back. Phase 3 is this disorganization and a feeling of despair. And stage 4 is like reorganized behavior. That's the thing that we want. I want to speak more about the next thing, which is the next slide. And that is the task of grieving. I really like this. And J. William Warden, you can get more information, and I really suggest that you look at it. I find that my background, I spent probably about 18 months in oncology and palliative care. And then spent time even when in the VA, in family support, American Family Counseling. And now I'm in the mental health rehabilitation residential programs. In every one of those contexts, when I've dealt with people, yes, it is. I'm glad you're familiar with Warden. This whole idea of task I really like it, and I think it's more applicable to us. The first task is to accept the reality of the loss. Secondly, to process the pain of grief. Third, to adjust to a world without the deceased. And fourth, to find enduring connection with the deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. So I'm going to spend some time talking about each one of them. So first is accepting the reality of the loss, which could be one of the most difficult things for people to do, especially when we're talking about complicated grief, compounded grief, mass grief, and even those who don't want to even acknowledge that they have not done some of their grief work. On the surface, a person may accept the reality of the loss. However, accomplishing this task requires that the loss and the correlating impact of the loss be accepted. So, yeah, we have to accept the fact that our career is over, accept the fact that someone had to be medically discharged, have to accept it, but it sounds easier than not. So challenges to the task is denial. Don't want to accept it. It didn't happen. I just want to think that my loved one's going to be with me all the time. Even denial through delusion. And there we have our mental health. This mummification is something, again, as we listen to the stories of people, mummification can be just like the person that I told you about that actually paid for the storage unit for 3 years. That entire storage unit was created. It's like almost like a crypt for that person. Another story that's interesting that comes to mind to demonstrate this is a veteran who wife died and decided to get married. So on the surface, it seems like he had, grieved and ready to move on. But in the bedroom, in his bedroom, was the wedding dress hanging on the door. And you know how wedding dresses are all padded and almost look human, is the wedding dress of the former wife. His mummy was the wedding dress, and that is what he kept. It became a problem because, of course, now he has a new spouse, that's trying to be a part of his life. So that's where we had to meet him. Even minimizing the loss is one of the challenges of accepting the reality of it. Next slide. The absence of artifacts that may remind them of the deceased. There are some instances, again, where we may hear the stories of people and they'll talk about after someone died, they went through the house and cleaned up everything, cleaned out everything. So as a result of cleaning everything out, they wanted to literally rid themselves of any visual memory. That's a problem when it comes to accepting the loss. The selective forgetting. Even spiritualism, where some people can even use something that could be so positive to help in coping their spirituality. That same spirituality, they can use that to be harming them. One example that comes to mind is when people use spiritualism, especially those who have alternate beliefs. And I'm thinking of a case where someone believed in some practices like voodoo. And as a result of this whole belief in voodoo and belief in the afterlife and where the body is and how the person is functioning, they were able to create this reality. They were able, okay, Joyce, we can talk about that later. They would be able to create this reality. And that was their spiritualism that often would be something to help for coping, but was used for something kind of toxic. Even reconciling the intellectual as well as the emotional acceptance. What about when a person believes the deceased visits them? You know what? Hold that question. Let's talk about it in a few minutes because I think it's going to be more applicable when we start talking about helping people with enduring. Okay. All right. Next slide. Oh, wait a minute. That is the next slide. Okay. So wait. So accepting the reality of loss, and we're going to talk about deaths from suicide in a moment, but accepting the reality of loss, another challenge is that when there is a death from suicide, since that's not socially acceptable way to die, that is one of the tougher deaths for people to accept. Any type of traumatic death, those gone too soon, car accident, even those who are lost in battle. That's a traumatic death, very difficult. One thing I discovered about my PTSD veterans, sometimes I visualize them walking through life holding the spirits of all of the dead. Some of them have had a hard time to reconcile and to even be challenged by the deaths because they're holding them. Even the deaths from overdose are hard. Stigmatized deaths are difficult. Some of the deaths, well, of course, suicide is stigmatized, overdose is stigmatized. But even when we have a death where there's a spouse and then there's another woman, sometimes it's hard for the other person. The second task is to process the pain of the grief. So they have to experience the physical, emotional, and spiritual pain of the death, of the loss. So one of the challenges, a couple of the challenges, is using something that will assist in avoiding or suppressing the pain. The first thing that comes to my mind is drug and alcohol use. It's anything that is gambling. What can suppress the pain and allow that person to function in a place of denial? When someone is unprepared to deal with or the sheer force that emotions, the follow of the loss, that's difficult to process the pain of grief. And one thing that's important, and I know you probably do this, and you may have done it in CPE, is talking about the attachment styles. Sometimes when you're in when you have decided to see a veteran for a number of sessions, to do any grief and loss work. Sometimes it's really important to go back in their history and talk about their history with attachment. What was that like with them? Did they have secure attachments? Did they have insecure attachments? That will give us a clue as to how they have dealt with it in the past. Have they lost loved ones before? How did they deal with losing those loved ones? That gives a clue. It also gives them a clue because they can start thinking about their own sense of resiliency. At the same time, it gives us clues as to, wow, as we start talking about their losses in the past, they haven't dealt with grandpa. They haven't dealt with the fact that mom left them and didn't come back. They haven't dealt with all of these things. So it gives us now more information when they've come into our office or we've met them someplace, and the presenting problem is the loss, the immediate loss, that we see that we're now dealing with that immediate loss and all the other losses. Go to the next slide. So the other thing about the process is that when it's hard for people to cut off, when they cut off feelings or deny and avoid, is very difficult. If they're even stimulating only pleasant thoughts, and this is huge. As ministers now, I belong to the African Methodist Episcopal Church. Yes, because all grief is connected to our lives. Sometimes even from a place of coping, and we just need to be able to listen carefully. If someone is saying, yes, I've lost this person, but they're with the Lord, and amen, hallelujah, and everything's great. Now, in some cases, it might be great. They may have been able to use their resources. I have seen that, yep. They may have been able to use their resources, and they really have been able to get over or reconcile with or deal with the loss. But this is why we have to be so vigilant in think it's a Dagwood sandwich, yes. This is why we have to be so vigilant when it comes to listening to the stories. Because on one hand, someone may be stimulating some very pleasant thoughts about the loss of that loved one, or, oh my goodness, yeah, I lost my leg, but oh, thank God, I got another one. But at the same time, we may see some other behaviors. We may recognize some other cognitions. And it's giving us a clue that, wait a minute, although they're saying on one hand, that, oh, I'm so happy, I'm so great. But in reality, they haven't dealt with the loss. Yes, they may be, and they may be saying what they think we need to hear. But that's why, as trained chaplains, we make a safe space for people to really tell their story authentically and honestly as possible. So people avoid reminders, and I talked about that before, and even have that vivid sense of the dead person's continuing presence. And I think that's where your question came in earlier. That if there's this belief that my loved one is visiting me every day, or my loved one is visiting me every night, or what have you, that means my loved one is still with me. When does that become maladaptive? It depends on the person. Yes, they do. When it becomes maladaptive, and the question about when it becomes maladaptive depends on the person, depends on their overall outlook of life. We may look at it and say, oh no, these ghosts visiting you every day is unrealistic. But for them, that might be what gives them peace. And it might come from a cultural standpoint about dealing with loss. However, if they're saying this, and at the same time we see some other maladaptive stuff, we may have to continue doing some work with them. Okay, next, you can go to the next one, back to the next. So the third task is that yes, some do hide behind God. The third task is that there has to be some external adjustments in order to adjust to the world after the loss. Here comes the work right here. Some people may actually come to us and say, my psychologist, and this is how I usually get them, The psychiatrist told me I need to come and see you, or the psychologist has referred me to you, and there's a consultant for grief and loss because something is wrong, and I need to get over, and I need to, something happened. And then we say, okay, we're finding them, or we're meeting them at this place where they say they want to adjust to the world after the loss. But task 1 and task 2 hasn't been done yet. So the work of task 1 and task 2 has to be done before we can talk about adjusting to the world after the loss. So how the death or loss affects everyday functioning in the world, that's going to be the external adjustment. Now, the book says it can range from 3 to 6 months, but we all know, and based on our experiences, that it really depends on the individual. It really depends on their attachment styles, and it depends on how they've handled losses or what types of losses they've had in the past. So it also depends on them coming to terms with the loss and the depth of the loss. If I was a spouse and my husband was the breadwinner for 30 years and I've never worked, and then here it is, my husband has died, I now have a loss on many levels. My loved one is dead. My partner is dead. My assumptive world has crashed. Financially, life is changing. So there's a depth, and we can go on and on and on of all the things that's going to happen. I may lose my house. Yes. Socially, it's going to be different because now the social connections I've had before will change. Culturally, it's going to change. So remember, when you think about the depth of the loss, we can go and list on and on and on and on and on. So one thing that we want to do when engaging someone is that, yes, so many levels. We want to be able to ask them, tell us about it. But I'm actually going to tell you how to do something in a minute. It's going to help with that. Go ahead to the next slide. So adjusting to the world, the loss of roles played. Thank you. Loss of the roles played by the deceased. Remember, here it is, my husband. And even, and I was talking about the spouse, but here it is, I've lost my leg. And I was a roofer. You know what I'm saying? So this thing can go. So now if I lost my leg and I'm a roofer, how does that change me? What has to happen? I had to be retooled. This has to happen. Okay, I'm going to be out of work for a while. I'm going to be depressed. You see how it levels? So when we dig and excavate, it gets deeper and deeper and deeper. But since we're trained chaplains, we can handle it. So now I have, yes, the loss of the roles played by the deceased, a new skill development for survivors. Now that families got to function differently. If I've lost my limb, if someone is sick, and we didn't even really talk about sickness, long-term illness. So long-term illness is now going to impact everything. It's going to impact the individual. It's going to impact all around them. It's going to impact the way they see themselves, the way they present themselves to the world. So we have new skill development to accommodate the new ways of functioning. I've got to now make meaning out of my life, and my meaning has to change. So if I've seen myself as a fully functioning human being and been able to make my own way and do these things, and I'm a Marine, hoorah, and I'm doing all of these things, then all of a sudden I'm losing. So the muscle mass I used to have is gone. That's a loss. I have to see myself differently. How do I begin to see myself differently? And that's part of the work that we may have to do with our veterans. So I have to invent new meaning for every aspect of myself, emotionally, physically, spiritually. Every part of me, I have to reinvent some new meaning when it comes to adjusting the world. And I need to change the slide without the deceased. Yes, it is so much work. What's so beautiful about it is that we can help them with it. Yes, that's major. So adjust to the world without the loss, death. So the internal adjustments, how the death affects one's sense of self. how death impacts self-definition, self-esteem, self-efficacy. Yes. This whole idea about self-definition, a woman who defined herself through the relationships with caring for others. We can go to the next one. Self-esteem, a person whose sense of self-esteem is dependent on the person who they are attached, or a person whose self-esteem is dependent upon who I define myself as. If I was a squared away soldier, and for whatever happened, even if it's my loss of mental capacity, my self-esteem is going to be truly bruised. The self-efficacy, the bereaved perceive themselves as helpless, inadequate, and incapable of not caring for themselves because their loved one is gone or life has changed. All right, next. So the spiritual adjustments, how the death affects one's beliefs, values, and assumptions about the world. Wow. You know, immediately I think about my PTSD veterans. I work very closely with the PTSD group here. And one of the things that I do is try to, not even just a moral injury standpoint, but from the spiritual adjustment that I have lost the assumptive world that everything is okay. It's not okay. Bad things do happen in very ugly ways that they can't get out of their head and they keep dreaming about. So here we have this loss of direction of life. And this is in every tier. It doesn't matter what part of the hospital we work in, what type of veterans we work in. We now have people who have now lost the direction of life as a result of this loss or death. It's going to shake the foundation of their belief systems. I remember a pastor that I knew whose daughter, a teenage daughter, died after several years of a battle with cancer. And he could not preach for 2 years because he was praying and believing in God to heal his daughter. And when the daughter died, it was really tough for him. So I put this, why God, like a question, God, why did this happen to me? Why did this loss happen to me? Why did it impact me this way? And it could be, why God, like anger. Why God? Oh, I'm angry. And then that's where we find our veterans as well, especially in places like mental health and PTSD, even those who work in the spinal cord injury, in those areas, those traumatic brain injury, those people who go sometimes very lucid, sometimes not. So you see how it really impacts all of us in every part of our work. You can go to the next slide. Yes, holy anger. I like that term. So adjusting to the world. Challenge to assumptions. Janet Baldwin's 3 basic assumptions. Here's the challenges to that. The world is a benevolent place. The world makes sense. And the person is worthy. It's not how to find an answer, but it's how to live without one. I think you just put up there that holy anger. How do I get to this place of peace and contentment without one? Without the answer of why God? Question, why God? Exclamation. Next slide. So here's the whole idea about finding enduring connection with deceased in the midst of embarking on a new life. The continuing bonds. I remember, and this goes back to attachment theory, so you may have to go back to attachment theory and read something. Yes, you're right, Michael. If you all remember Snoopy and Linus and the whole gang, and there's one of them used to walk around with that blanket. I cannot remember his name.
Linus.
Linus had the blanket all the time. That blanket was a continuing bond from his childhood attachment. So you see how attachment theory comes back in here again. Sometimes we are going to have something that's going to keep us connected with the loved one in the midst of embarking on a new life. Because the loved one, your leg, the way you used to be, the job you used to have, all of those things are still very much a part. The Harvard Child Bereavement Study, and you can look this up, it talked about with children who have lost loved ones, that they've discovered that speaking to, thinking of, dreaming of, and feeling watched by their loved ones actually helped them in their bereavement. Can you imagine? You've heard it before, like, oh, grandpa's looking down on you from heaven. That actually helps children. So to find an appropriate place for the dead in their emotional lives. Now, the person I spoke about earlier that had the wedding dress, we had to really talk about the wedding dress. The wedding dress had to be removed, but it had to be done in a good way. The one I talked about with the storage facility filled with items, I'm still working with him right now. And one thing that he's doing is he's taking out one item at a time. It's going to take us forever to do everything, but he's just taking out precious items and we're processing the items. We're going through his memories and just processing his memories because he's actually ready to date someone right now. You can go to the next slide. So finding an enduring connection, we want not to have emotional withdrawal from the person, meaning that, okay, I used to be married, I'm going to move on. Even a divorce, a separation is a loss. Oh, okay, it is what it is. I'm going to take it in the past. No, it's not going to be an emotional, yes. Yes, minus the blanket. It's not going to be an emotional withdrawal. It's just that it's going to be a relocation. How do we now still have a continuing bond that can be healthy? Because that person and those memories are still with you. And this is something that we can help people with. Challenges to the task, and I talked about this earlier, past attachment precludes one from forming new ones. And that's really going to be their attachment styles. Stuck and then realize that their life has stopped. Most difficult, and it seems like those are the ones that we get oftentimes when they realize that their life has stopped, when they realize that, oh my gosh, it's been several years since this has happened to me, or I detached from the Army 10 years ago and I still haven't been able to move on. That's usually when we get them. Most difficult, but not impossible. Go to the next one. So now mediators are mourning, and you're going to have access to these slides. So this is what I want. This is where our work comes in, these mediators. The mediators help us understand why people handle the task of mourning in difficult ways. And mediators help us assess the person's need. First mediator, who died, and what was the relationship? What was the relationship? Yes, sir. They are in there, Kristen. Okay, next one. The next slide. Mediator two, the nature of the attachment. And I talked about this before, the strength of the attachment, security of the attachment, was the ambivalence in the relationship, the conflicts with the deceased, dependency. All of these things happen just by conversation. Having a conversation, being open. All right, next slide. This is where our work comes in. Mediator number 3. How did the person die? Geography, where were they? Suddenness, was it unexpected? Was it violence or trauma? Was it multiple losses? Are they suffering from bereavement overload? Are there ambiguous deaths? Are there stigmatized deaths? What is going on with this death? This is going to help us as a chaplain as we journey with this person through their process. You can go to the next one. Mediator number 4 is the historical antecedents. What is the history of the previous losses? And I've talked about much of this already. Were they grieved? Have they been holding on to these losses? Yes, AIDS was huge. Are they unresolved? Are there mental health concerns? How has a family of origin dealt with loss and grief? What has this person learned about losing? Remember if any of you had kids and had pets and the pet fish would die, we would have a funeral. We've had a funeral for the pet fish and the pet bird after they died. so we could talk about death and loss. So did they have those experiences? Mediator number 5, what's the personality of the person that's going through this? What's their age, their gender? We will discover that, especially age and gender, and even geography, their culture. And I need to put that on there, their cultural understanding of it. Style of coping and problem solving, attachment style, the cognitive style, the ego strength, what's their self-esteem, their self-efficacy, what are their values and beliefs? Who is this person we're working with? Next slide. Mediator number 6, what are the social variables? Okay, they say 6 months to a year. Okay, maybe, maybe not. It depends on if they've done some work. What is the value of the perceived social support? Support satisfaction, social role involvements, religious resources, ethnicity. What do they have access to besides you, the chaplain, to tap into? Do they have a religious group? Do they connect to family? And sometimes our job as we're speaking to them, yes, you can go to the next slide. Concurrent stresses, any type of secondary losses. Now, I wish I was in front of you right now because there's some activity that I do. It's called a mapping for grief and loss. And with the mapping exercise for grief and loss, and I couldn't figure out how to put this in here. It's an activity. It's in one of the books. And with the mapping exercise, you actually put the loss in the middle of the circle. You get it on a big board or something. You put the loss in the middle of the circle. And then you look at all of the secondary losses as a result of that major loss. So, for example, let me go back to my loss with my spouse. So the spouse has died. So one of my issues is that I've lost income. I've lost my home. I lost my friends. I've lost this. I've lost that. And then you start literally creating bubbles with all the losses. And when you map it out like that, sometimes it helps them to have a visual of it. And then secondly, you can understand where do we start? Where do we start working? Some of those things we're not going to do. Some of those things are going to be, they have to connect to some type of social avenue or something else. Go to the next slide. I'm really trying to keep my hour. Yes. The chaplain, what do? We listen for clues. We allow the patient to lead. Everyone assesses loss, grieves, and mourns differently. And when is it finished? We don't know when it's going to be finished. It depends on the person. Some people come in to us and they're actually saying, people keep telling me they don't want to hear my story anymore because they keep talking, they keep ruminating over and over again. They've been ruminating for 10 years. So we allow them into our safe, non-judgmental space, and we just work with them where they are. And it would be surprising to you that some work with people on grief and loss, they may be able to get much further in a few sessions with us than they did in 10 years. What does finish look like? It depends on that person. And how do we help the survivor actualize the loss? And then we help survivor identify experience and feelings, and we help survivors overcome obstacles to readjustment after loss. 2 things that I'm doing here, tell and retell their stories, absolutely. One thing that I did in the MHRRTP where I work, I have a grief wreath. And if you can recall the Christmas wreaths that you get at the craft store, the wire things, they have like 3 tiers of wire. Oh, wait a minute, I can get it. I forgot I'm in my office. So here's my grief wreath. I don't know if you can really see it. And my grief wreath has 3 tiers. And what I have is that I have strips of uniforms, Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines, and grief wreath. Yes. And the grief wreath is awesome because I have Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines. Who did I just leave out? Army, Air Force, Navy, Marines.
Coast Guard.
Coast Guard.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you. Yes, I want you to adopt it because you get the old uniforms. People will donate the old uniforms to you. And what happens in your spirituality class and when you're dealing with an individual, my grief wreath stays in my office, is that I have all of the strips and they take the strip from their branch of service. Oh, they've taken from a branch of service and you can't really see it. They write the person's name on it or the thing. And what happens is that it becomes this beautiful wreath, and then they see that they're in community grieving. Okay? This is one idea that I have. And I'm currently working on a memorial garden because I have a 169-bed facility, and grief is a major part of our story. So the veterans and I are cleaning out this green space. It's a huge green space where I'm going to create I'm going to create a memorial garden so the grief wreath concept can go larger, because there's always something that they're grieving about. There's always some work that we have to do. So let me go back to the slide for a minute. So we want to help in meaning making. What does it mean for that person to have this loss? What does it mean to them? And I know it sounds crazy, but people, when you say that to people, they really have to think about it. Wow, what is that like for you? Yes, yes. What is that like for you? How do you feel about it? Those basic questions that chaplains ask are so powerful because it helps people to start vocalizing it and making meaning. So now we want to help the survivor continue the bond with the deceased while feeling comfortable with reinvesting in life. Okay, they've been held up in the house for 3 years because they've lost their minds and they don't think that the world wants to accept them. Yes, they've isolated. I'm not just talking about PTSD. Other people isolate as well. So maybe its suggestion is, maybe you want to go to the park. What would it be like? What gives you peace? What gives you harmony? What does it for you? It might be looking at the trees, looking at the water, whatever it is. We're going to help that. We're going to interpret normal. We want to interpret normal and let them know that even though they've been grieving for 10 years, it's okay. And we want to use evocative language. We want to provide a safe, non-judgmental time and space to grieve. And remember that everyone is unique. Everyone is unique. Next slide. Okay, we want to assess and suggest spiritual resources. Whatever spiritual resources work for them. Prayer, meditation, mindfulness, self-soothing activities, etc. And I wish I could go on, Christian, I wish I could do a whole class on self-soothing activities. I'm going to tell you, I've been, for the last year, I've been becoming like this trauma specialist with some classes that I've been taking. And I've been incorporating this whole concept of self-soothing activities, not just a mindfulness, helping people ground. I'm telling you, it's awesome. We have to talk about it another time. But I may have to add another book because there's a book that I really like that has a lot of suggestions in there. And consider cultural dynamics. Please consider cultural dynamics. Help people explore their culture and what makes sense to them. And it might be contrary to our own beliefs, but it's something that's going to help them. Okay? Next slide. Now, okay. Any questions about grief? You all know you can email me or something because I know that was a lot.
It was very thorough, Diane. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Yes, yes. Now, suicide postventions. Suicide postvention. What we want to remember about that, and I only had 3 slides, so I'm glad I don't have that much time. So suicide postvention is an organized response in the aftermath of suicide. Aftermath of suicide. To facilitate healing of individuals from grief and distress of suicide loss. Remember what we said about suicide. This is not an acceptable loss. So those who have been left behind now have to mitigate the effects of the exposure to suicide. We also deal with first responders, which many of our veterans are first responders, that they now have been exposed to suicide. And we want to prevent suicide among people who are at high risk after exposure to suicide. Those who have been exposed to suicide, who have witnessed a suicide, whose close family members have committed suicide, are at high risk. And let me say this about us here at the VA, and that's another workshop we have to do another time. I created that for the VA, which is compassion fatigue, which that's not the time for me to talk about it. So need I not digress? All right, go to the next slide. So suicide loss survivor and survivor of suicide loss are used to describe someone who is bereaved by suicide. And some prefer not to be called survivor because they perceive themselves as a victim of a calamity. Again, listen to the language. Because if someone has lost a loved one, they may consider themselves a survivor. But now we have a loss that is not acceptable. Well, and sometimes it may be survivor's guilt, but it might be sprinkled with anger. Because I'm a victim. How dare him or how dare her commit suicide and leave me here? And I want you to keep in mind, when you're dealing with veterans who have had suicide in their families very early in life, we may get them much later, 20s, 30s, 40s, 50s, 60s, and so on. They still may consider themselves a victim of the calamity, and they still may be holding on to the anger. So again, listen out for that. For every suicide, there are several loss survivors. One source cites up to 6 survivors for every loss. Y'all get that? 6 survivors for every loss. So that means that it's very likely that we're dealing with that. Keep in mind that we have our veterans, those who have been in combat, that they are dealing with this as well. So the feelings associated with postvention is shock and anger, depression, rejection, denial, shame and stress and loneliness and pain and despair and sadness, abandonment, numbness, disbelief, guilt, and anxiety. Now, interestingly enough, there's 2 terms on there that we didn't see before, and that's rejection and abandonment, because someone may be seeing that as a direct assault to them because this person took their lives. We don't want to reframe how they see it. We just want to hear the story. We can go to the next slide. Next slide. Okay. So the nature of suicide bereavement is that it's unique because suicide itself is a singular manner of death. Factors that influence the experienced loss of the survivors are: it creates ambiguity about the volition of the deceased, is characterized as preventable in the population, and it's disrupted social bonds. How do you deal with the stigma surrounding suicide? We normalize it. Like any other loss, we have to help people to normalize it by seeing that they're not alone in the struggle and that we're not going to stigmatize them. We're never going to be able to control the rest of the society. But one thing that we can do is we travel with our veterans as they deal with this, or our veterans' families as they deal with this, is that we can first and foremost normalize it and create a safe space where they can really tell their story. Okay, next slide. So the factors, the influence is suicide. Okay, suicide is stigmatized. We talked about that. Suicide is a traumatic event. It is shocking, tremendous shame, blame, guilt, and anger, fear and anger, and even sometimes relief. Now, again, remember, we're normalizing it. So we have family members who have been struggling with their loved one, and their loved one has been attempting a lot. The loved one may, have tremendous addictive behavior, whatever the behavior is. They may have this ambiguity where it's like, wow, on one part of me is really sad, but this other part of me is relieved. So just listen for that. All right, next slide. Provide a presence. Listen. Provide a space for the narrative. And you know, when we do narrative, we just listen more than we talk. Help with reconnecting social bonds. And it might be reconnecting with other people, because if they've got family members who have stigmatized it so much, you told that boy had never been good, or blah, blah, blah. If they've got family members, maybe they have to reconnect with some other social bonds that's life-giving. When possible, create a support group. If you have a lot of them in your area, it might be a spirituality group. Assess and suggest spiritual resources, prayer, meditation, mindfulness, self-soothing activities. Employ bereavement interventions when appropriate. See, two things happening here with the postvention is that you're dealing immediately with the fallout from the suicide. So we may not go into traditional bereavement care immediately. So we may be traveling with this person for a while. Go ahead, next slide. Okay, read the bibliography, and I'm at my hour. Look at that. Yeah. So, thank you all. I know that was a lot in 1 hour. But what I will do, Christian, I will send you. It wasn't really related, but I think that it is related, because I think that if we could learn how to even help people self-soothe, that when they come to us with high anxiety, there's some things that we can do to just help them go down.
I think that's very important. So I want to thank you, Dianne and Chaplain McGlen, for coming and spending your morning with us. If you have questions about this, feel free to send them to Chaplain McGlen, and we'll get the contact info out for you. You're also welcome to post them within the classroom or email them to Chaplain Cassidy and I, and we'll help facilitate those conversations as well. So I hope you guys have a blessed rest of the week, and if you are catching up on paperwork and catching up on classroom stuff, please continue to stay in contact with us to let us know how you're doing and if you need more time. Other than that, you guys have a blessed rest of the week. Peace out.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.